Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event entitled The Populist, Revolt, Merit, and the Common Good with our very special guest, Michael Sandel. Our program this evening is the first of a spring term series of programs at St. Olaf College on the topic of America after Trump. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm a professor at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring tonight's event and the spring series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and support free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive, civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, as always, very special thanks go to Institute staff, Assistant Director Eric Grell, Administrative Assistant Linda Carlson, and Student Assistant Jess Horst. Thank also to Jeff O'Donnell, Joshua Wyatt, and the St. Olaf Broadcast Media Services crew, and to Andrea Galswick, Dan Hollering, and Carrie Vanderveen of St. Olaf Marketing and Communications. Finally, thanks to St. Olaf College faculty and students who have integrated their study with our program this evening, particularly participants in the public affairs conversation, supported by the Institute, directed by Professor Jason Marsh, and taught this term by Professor and Institute postdoctoral fellow Brendan Wessler. But thanks also to courses in St. Olaf's Philosophy Department, chaired by Professor Danny Munoz Hutchinson. To remind our virtual audience members, you are invited to submit a question at any point during the discussion this evening by using the Participate tab on the streaming page. We are honored to have with us tonight Harvard political philosopher and best-selling author Michael Sandel, who challenges audiences to examine the various moral perplexities we confront in politics, business, and our everyday lives. Named by the journal Foreign Policy as one of the top 100 global thinkers, Sandel has been described by Newsweek as the most relevant living philosopher, and as a rock star moralist, and by the New Republic as the most famous teacher of philosophy in the world. Sandel's many writings on justice, democracy, morals, and markets have been translated into 27 languages. His New York Times bestseller, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, has sold over 2 million copies worldwide and inspired public debate about the ethical and civic questions of our time. Another book of his, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, was named one of Foreign Policy's 20 must-read books of the year. His 6-part series on the same topic, What Money Can't Buy, was hosted by the Ford Foundation. For years, Sandel served on the President's Council on Bioethics, exploring the ethical implications of new biomedical technologies. This prompted him to write The Case Against Perfection, Ethics in the Age of Genetic Engineering, a book about the moral quandaries that arise when we seek to perfect our children and ourselves. Sandel's legendary course on justice was the first Harvard course to be made freely available online and on public television. It has been viewed by millions of people around the world, including in China, where China Newsweek named him the most influential foreign figure of the year. Sandel's lectures have been the subject of television series on PBS and BBC. His ongoing BBC radio series, The Public Philosopher, engages audiences in debates about the big philosophical questions. He has also appeared on The Colbert Report, Today, and Morning Joe television programs. His lecture tours have taken him across 5 continents to speak before packed audiences in famous venues such as St. Paul's Cathedral in London and the Sydney Opera House. In 2020, Sandel released his most recent book, The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good. In it, he argues that to overcome the crises that are upending our world, we must rethink the attitudes towards success and failure that have accompanied globalization and rising inequality. The Tyranny of Merit was named Best Book of 2020 by multiple outlets, including Bloomberg. There is much more that might be said about Michael Sandel's remarkable career. Other details are available on our Institute's website dedicated to this event tonight. But for now, Michael Sandel, welcome. We are pleased and honored to have you with us this evening.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you at St. Olaf and at the Institute for Freedom and Community, and to be in conversation with you, Professor Santuri, and with faculty, colleagues, and students.
Thank you. We're so happy to have you. Michael, our topic tonight is the populist revolt, merit, and the common good. Some context. In 2016, as we all know, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. In 2020, Trump lost the presidency. But the election, though clearly decided, wasn't a blowout. And if the CPAC event of last weekend was any indication, Trump seems to have retained substantial political support despite the astounding events of last January. Now, it's become pretty standard fare to cast Trump supporters as agents of a populist revolt. Some associate that revolt with things that aren't very nice: racism, anti-immigrant nativism, ethnic nationalism, things like that. But in your account, it is a mistake to reduce this revolt simply to morally unsavory things like racism, nativism, and ethnic nationalism, though you wouldn't deny, presumably, that some of Trump's supporters are motivated by such things. According to you, though, this populist revolt has been, in an important sense, a revolt against what you call the tyranny of merit. And those who have been engaged in this revolt have had, in your account, a reasonable and rightful complaint of a sort. Trump supporters and others like them, in your view, have felt humiliated, left out, dismissed, denigrated by the so-called elite, the privileged, the winners in our society. And in your estimation, this feeling of humiliation is in some measure understandable. Indeed, the feeling grounds, in your view, indignation, resentment, and grievance that must be taken seriously if we are to forge the kind of solidarity necessary to promote and sustain the common good. Michael, could you explain to us what all of this means? And let's start more particularly with this specific question. What precisely is the tyranny of merit that is fomented, in your view, this understandable, reasonable, rightful populist revolt?
Well, yes, first of all, thank you, Ed, for that masterful summary of my book, The Tyranny of Merit. And I want to hasten to emphasize the point that you made, is that I am by no means denying that Trump's racist appeals and xenophobic sentiments were a part of his appeal for many voters. What I am suggesting is that that's not the whole story, and that we miss something important if we don't think beyond the racism and xenophobia that were part of Trump's political appeal. Which brings us to what I call the tyranny of merit. And the tyranny of merit, in brief, is about the way we brought about a society of winners and losers, where those who struggle feel that elites are looking down on them. Let me try to explain. Perhaps we could take a step back. In recent decades, the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, pulling us apart. Now, this has partly to do with the widening inequalities of recent decades, but it's not only that. It has also to do with changing attitudes toward success, toward winning and losing, that have come with it. Those who have succeeded in the global economy have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve all of the material rewards and benefits that society heaps upon them. And they also tend to believe that if they deserve their rewards, by implication, those who struggle must deserve their fate as well. Now, this divide between winners and losers, these attitudes toward success, are connected to a seemingly attractive ideal, the ideal of merit, the idea that we should reward merit. Now, on the face of it, merit is a good thing. If I need surgery, I want a well-qualified doctor to perform it. So how does merit turn toxic? How does it become, as it has become, a source of polarization and anger and resentment? I think in the following way. The meritocratic idea says that if chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. And those who don't land on top deserve their fate too. Now, there are really two problems with meritocracy. One of them is that we don't live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. Chances are not truly equal. We know that. But even if we could achieve a perfect meritocracy, there would be a problem. And it has to do with these attitudes toward success, the tendency of the successful to inhale too deeply of their own success. Meritocracy has a dark side that is corrosive of the common good. And the dark side is that it generates hubris among the winners and demoralization, even humiliation among those left behind, which brings us to our present political moment, because one of the most potent sources of the appeal of Donald Trump and of other hyper-nationalist populists around the world is the appeal to the sense of grievance and resentment that many working people have, that elites are looking down on them with disdain. Credentialed elites, meritocratic elites, college-educated professional elites. And I think this grievance, there is something to it. And unless progressive parties, responsible parties, center-left and center-right parties figure out a way to address this sense of grievance, the sense that working people feel looked down upon, the sense that they feel their work is not valued by the wider society, then I think it's going to be very difficult to dissipate the anger and resentment to which Trump and figures like him appeal. Ed.
Thank you, Michael. I'm wondering if we could probe philosophically your attitude toward merit a bit more. Regarding merit, as you've suggested now in your remarks, you seem to pose two questions at least. One is, do people get what they deserve in fact in our society? Is virtue rewarded in fact in our society? And your answer is, not surprisingly, not always. And that is reason for just complaint in certain circumstances. But there's a second question you seem to pose, I think, which is deeper, and you were sort of moving toward that in your final remarks here. How much do people ever really finally merit or deserve anything in the way of reward for their talents, their products, or their efforts? Now, you do say, and you just said now, you do say that there are good reasons for rewarding merit. Rewarding merit promotes efficiency and productivity. And it's fair, right? You want to give the A to the paper that deserves it, not the paper that doesn't deserve it. But in certain moments, you also seem to flirt with the idea that deep down, finally, people don't really intrinsically merit or deserve compensation or reward for their talents or their productions or their efforts because, for example, whatever talents they may have are the random outcome of the genetic lottery, and even you're having the disposition to expend effort in exercising your talent is a function of your biology and your social formation. So you often talk this way, sometimes when you're commenting on other philosophers like John Rawls, who makes something like this point. And then this seems to liberate you then to make some fairly bold proposals about moving away from or severely limiting meritarian systems that are in place in our society. So, for example, we'll talk about this later, your proposal about moving in the direction of a lottery system for college admissions. So I guess what I'm left wondering somewhat from having read the book is how thoroughgoing exactly is your critique of desert or merit? At times you seem pretty skeptical about judgments of merit and desert. Deep down, metaphysically, no one really deserves anything in some sense. Is that an overread of your position, or are you in some measure a skeptic about desert in that way, in that thoroughgoing philosophical way?
Right. Well, it's really an astute and challenging question, Edmund. You are right that I am not simply criticizing meritocracy on the grounds that we don't live up to it. I do think the ideal is flawed. Now, how exactly is it flawed? I think it's important to distinguish between the role of effort and the role of talents in qualifying people for various rewards and benefits. I don't want to deny that some people do work harder than others. Some people strive conscientiously and strenuously. Others don't. Some people seek to cultivate their talents more assiduously than others. And I don't want to deny that effort is a good thing, something we should encourage and admire up to a point. But it's important to notice that even the most convinced defender of meritocracy doesn't really believe that rewards should be allocated according to effort alone. If you imagine two construction workers, let's say, one who is strong and able to raise a building without too much effort in an hour, and then take so the first one doesn't work all that hard, but builds a building in an hour, or a wall, let's say. And then there's a rather scrawny, weak construction worker who labors tirelessly, endlessly, perspires all day long, and can only build, let's say, a 1 foot of the wall. No one would say that in virtue of the superior effort, the second worker deserves to be paid more or the same as the one who produces the greatest result. Or think of the great runner, the sprinter, Usain Bolt. He's the fastest runner in the world. He wins the gold medal. Now, he trains hard, but he has a training partner, a friend, who is also a good runner. He finishes second often in international competition. He gets the silver. Usain Bolt has acknowledged that his friend, his training partner, practices and trains harder than he does. But that doesn't mean, even the meritocrat wouldn't say, therefore, that Usain Bolt's friend should win the gold in virtue of his superior effort. So I don't reject effort as an expression of human agency or as something worth admiring. But I would point out, Edmund, that effort isn't everything, even for the convinced meritocrat. It's not a sufficient basis for dessert, which brings us to talent. Usain Bolt is gifted as a runner. That's why, together with his effort, he wins the gold. And that's what we celebrate and valorize in the Olympics when we award the prizes. But what's the moral status of the talent as distinct from the effort? Well, we cultivate our talents, some of us more fully than others. But still, talents are, at least in part, a kind of gift for which we can claim no credit. And insofar as what we contribute, what we achieve, depends on an admixture of effort and talent. So long as talent has an aspect of gift beyond our own doing, to that extent, it's a mistake to think that what we achieve and what we contribute is all our own doing and therefore the basis for dessert. Does that address the question?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Do you think?
I would like to follow up on it.
Please.
In an ideal world, would we reward effort? Would that be would that be the criterion for distributing rewards in your ideal
No,
world?
I wouldn't say so. No, I would say no. I think in an ideal world, we would honor and reward contributions to the common good. Now, this introduces another complexity about merit and desert and my critique of merit, because typically we assume in a market-based society like ours that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. And so we assume that provided that markets are free and not distorted in ways that economists can specify, that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good, and that supports the intuition that the pay the labor market allocates corresponds to what people deserve. But this is a mistake. It's a mistake because what really counts as a valuable contribution to the common good depends on how the common good is properly understood. And if we understand the common good only to consist in satisfying the de facto consumer preferences that people happen to have, then we are considering the common good to consist maybe of base or ignoble preferences, preferences ideally that we would like people to overcome rather than to cater to through the labor market. Let me take a concrete example. I don't know if you saw the television series Breaking Bad. Did you see it, Edmund?
No, I have not seen it, I have to confess.
Okay, well, that's all right. I suspect some of the students saw it.
Probably.
But it's about the main character. I don't think this is too much of a spoiler. The main character is Walter White, who taught high school chemistry. And he wasn't very satisfied with the job because the students didn't pay attention in class, didn't much respect him. He wasn't that well paid. But then he used his skills as a chemist. He was a superb chemist to cook methamphetamine so pure, because he knew the chemistry, that it was very, very successful on the market. And he became a multimillionaire cooking meth and selling it through a syndicate. Long story. But so from the standpoint of the verdict of the market, Walter White, the hero of Breaking Bad, Walter White's contribution as a meth dealer was far greater than his contribution as a high school chemistry teacher. But the example brings out how morally misleading the market valuation of contributions can be. Because surely on reflection, few of us would say that producing perfect methamphetamine that people are willing to buy is more important, more valuable, more worthy than teaching high school chemistry. So this is a second, this is what I mean in reply to your question, Edmund, to suggest that in a perfect meritocracy, there would be an alignment, and this I would be in favor, between the value, the true value of people's contributions and the honor and rewards they receive. But the market is a misleading metric for that, even if we could create a perfect alignment between market value and reward. Do you see the distinction I'm trying to make?
Yes, I do. It makes perfect sense. What do you say in response to the free market critic who wants to say, well, you know, we live in a pluralistic society. We are not in agreement about what constitutes the good. And so as much as possible, then, we really need to leave these matters to the realm of freedom and interchange and exchange and free market and that sort of thing. And a market is a very efficient way of negotiating disagreements in some sense about what constitutes the good.
Yes.
And you have a vision of the good, but it may not be my vision of the good. And how are we going to proceed then in light of that? Wouldn't it be better just to let things go and let individuals make in their freedom their own decisions about the kinds of contracts they want to enter into and that sort of thing? And how would you respond to that kind of criticism? Yeah.
Right. This would be the libertarian free market criticism. And I would say, I would begin by acknowledging that, now first I should remind you that I was responding to your question, what in my view a true adequate meritocracy would consist in. And my reply is an alignment between reward and true contribution to the common good. But you're certainly right to point out that according to that ideal conception, we would have to deliberate and argue about the meaning of the good life, about the character of the common good. And this would involve competing conceptions of the common good. And it's also true, and I would agree, that the appeal of a pure laissez-faire free market way of defining the common good is that it seems to spare us messy, contentious debates and arguments about the common good. And in a pluralist society, this has a certain appeal, especially among politicians who like to avoid morally contested questions. But I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake for two reasons. I think it's a mistake, first of all, to, in the name of avoiding disagreement in politics, to outsource our moral judgments to markets. Because markets are not truly neutral instruments for resolving competing conceptions of the common good. They decide questions of the common good according to supply and demand, according to GDP. That is a determinate answer to the question that privileges certain conceptions of what's valuable and depreciates others. So it's not a neutral instrument. That would be my first reason for rejecting that outsourcing. But more fundamentally, the effect of ceding our judgments about the common good to markets and to GDP is that it impoverishes democratic public discourse. It leads to a kind of morally hollow kind of public discourse. It's true to debate the meaning of the common good and therefore the qualities and contributions we consider worthy of reward in our society. That involves disagreement. That involves what I would call the hard work of democratic citizenship. Part of what it means to be a democratic citizen is to deliberate, to reason together, even in the face of disagreements, about big ethical questions that matter. What does it mean to seek a just society? What should be the role of money in markets in a good society? What do we owe one another as citizens? How should we conceive the common good? These are all morally contested questions. And you're right, Edmund, that in a pluralist society, people will have different answers to these questions about justice, equality and inequality, civic obligation. But that is the heart of democracy. Not to flee engaging those disagreements, but to learn, to cultivate the ability to deliberate with one another about our competing conceptions of the good life, because part of what's at stake is, and this was our point of departure, what contributions to the economy and to the society as a whole do we want to encourage, do we want to honor, recognize, and reward? And I'm suggesting we can't decide that question responsibly as democratic citizens if we simply outsource that entire range of moral argument to markets.
Thank you, Michael. That makes perfect sense. In some sense that for you, meritocracy is the problem, at least as we experience it in our current state of affairs. So then what to do about it practically? And in your book, you make at least a couple of general proposals, which I think we should spend some time talking about. I mean, one involves your critique of colleges and universities as sorting or credentialing machines. And as a kind of response to that dysfunction, I think is what you would want to say, you propose a lottery for admissions as a kind of solution to the problem. And that's quite a radical proposal, it seems. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that, the rationale for it, and what precisely it means, and what you might say in response to people who think that, well, that's maybe too radical a departure from merit. We want to admit people based upon their credentials and that sort of thing. Could you say something about that set of concerns?
Yes. First, I want to make my proposal a little bit more plausible by adding the qualifier that I do in the book, which is I don't think that colleges and universities should admit students who are not qualified to flourish and to benefit from the education and to contribute to their fellow students. So I'm speaking about colleges that find themselves with more qualified applicants than they have places for, and this, by the way, would not apply to the majority of colleges and universities in the United States, which admit the vast majority of their applicants. But for those colleges and universities that have more applicants, more well-qualified applicants than they have places for, I suggest winnowing out those who would not flourish and do well in the college, and from among the qualified to do a lottery. For the following reason. First of all, I'm skeptical that even the most conscientious admissions officers can when they're looking at well-qualified students, fine-grained distinctions and predictions about which 18-year-olds really will contribute most to the society or to science or to business or to their chosen field. And here I'm thinking of an example from the world of sports. I'm a baseball fan. In fact, I grew up in the Twin Cities until I was 13 years old, and I was a Minnesota Twins fan. And so I've followed baseball for a very long time. Nolan Ryan was one of the greatest pitchers in baseball history. Unfortunately, he was not with the Twins. But he was drafted, and he's a first-round Hall of Famer, holds the record for lifetime strikeouts. Nolan Ryan, when he was drafted as an 18-year-old, I think he was the 249th draft pick at age 18. Tom Brady, the greatest quarterback in the history of the NFL, he was drafted when he was 18. 199th pick was Tom Brady in the draft. If our ability to predict even the skill of throwing a baseball or throwing a football is very difficult at age 18, how much more difficult is it to predict with any confidence who will wind up making scientific discoveries or leading the society or being a business leader or whatever the case may be? But more importantly, to get to this issue of merit, I think, just as you suggested, that colleges and universities, higher education has been cast in the role of sorting machine, arbiter of opportunity for a meritocratic society. Higher education confers the credentials and defines the merit that a market-based meritocracy rewards. And the result is there is tremendous pressure on young people through their high school years, in some cases before, to assemble, to prepare for standardized tests, to seek after grades, to add extracurricular activities of all sorts to the resume, to go off to sports lessons, ballet lessons, music lessons, and the like. The tremendous pressure, I think, is taking quite a toll on young people. We see this in the level of mental health issues among young people who emerge from this stress-strewn meritocratic gauntlet. And when they win admission, there's a tendency to inhale too deeply, to assume the attitude we were discussing earlier, that I deserve to be admitted because I tried so hard, I worked so hard. And it's hard not to believe that. So my idea of the lottery is to relieve at least a little of that intense pressure, to make clear what in any case is a role in admissions or succeeding in the economy, that luck plays a big part in it. It's important, I think, to send this message to the winners, those who are admitted, and also to send this message to those who don't win admission, so that they know that they're not getting into their preferred college is not a verdict on their worth or their virtue, but it's the result of a concatenation of factors, many of which have a lot to do with luck. So that's the rationale, Edmund. I don't know if that will be persuasive or even palatable to many of the students, but perhaps we'll see.
You know, the last observation, I think, many will find quite attractive, that we can be liberated in some measure from this sort of competitive fervor that leaves us damaged in many ways. So that's a very attractive proposal in that dimension. One of your
Could I add just one other thought?
Go ahead.
Could I add one other thought about that, Edmund? That in addition to the damage that it does to the emotional well-being, as well as to the social kind of outlook of students, I worry that the credentializing, sorting role of higher education, all of the networking and the competitive aspect, is beginning to drive out or to crowd out the intrinsic goods that higher education should ideally serve, which is to cultivate a love of teaching and learning, the ability of students to step back and figure out what's worth caring about and why, what their passions are, what fields of study they would ideally like to pursue. I fear that converting higher education into a sorting machine, into a credentializing institution, is distracting us. And by us, I mean students and faculty members and administrators from the intrinsic goods that ideally higher education should be about. So that's another worry I have about essentially casting higher education in the role of being the arbiter of opportunity for an intensely competitive meritocratic society.
A reviewer of your book, a man named Christopher Kurtz, I don't know if you came across his review in the Los Angeles Review of Books. He's a legal scholar at University of California, Berkeley. He says that your have you come by this review by any chance? Have you seen it?
I've seen it, yeah. Somebody told me about it.
He says that your your solution, I was wondering how you would react to this. Your solution is too much about Harvard and private elite colleges and universities, and not enough about the state universities, community colleges, and vocational schools, which in his view are the real engines of social transformation. I mean, what would you say in response to that criticism?
Well, I agree that the emphasis should be on, that we should place much more emphasis on community colleges, state colleges, and also vocational and technical training. And this is an argument that I make in the book. So if he missed it, I regret that. But one of the arguments I make in the book is precisely this, that the lottery solution is not a solution to the problem of meritocracy in higher education generally, by no means. It's only a way of addressing the stress-strewn, anxious meritocratic gauntlet. But in order to deal with the broader problem, what I think we need to do, at least for a start, is to recognize that we woefully underinvest in those forms of learning on which most people depend to prepare themselves for the world of work and of citizenship. Most people do not attend highly competitive colleges and universities. In fact, most Americans do not have a four-year college degree. Nearly two-thirds do not. So one of the main arguments of the Tyranny of Merit of the book is that it's folly to build an economy that sets as a necessary condition for dignified work and a decent life a college degree, a four-year college degree that most people don't have. Only about 35% do, and the figure is similar in most European countries. And so what I propose as the more fundamental response is that we need to invest in state colleges, community colleges, vocational and technical training centers. And beyond investing financially, we need to reverse the steep hierarchy of prestige that puts competitive colleges and universities at the apex and denies social recognition and esteem to these other forms of learning. I think that's right at the top of the proposals that I make in the book about how to reverse the meritocratic imbalance in higher education. Germany does much better than the US in investing in vocational and technical training and in conferring recognition and honor and esteem to people who go into the trades, for example. Whereas we have directed an excess of social esteem. We have valorized the highly credentialed professionals and professional classes at the expense of those forms of work and those contributions to the common good that may not require a four-year college degree or a professional degree, but that nonetheless are very important contributions. And if I could just give one example that's become abundantly clear during the pandemic, those of us who have the luxury of working from home during the COVID crisis have come to recognize, if we didn't know it before, how deeply we depend on workers we often overlook, not only those caring for COVID patients in the hospitals who are doing heroic work. I'm thinking also of delivery workers, warehouse workers, grocery store clerks, home healthcare providers, childcare workers. These are not the best paid or most honored members of our society. Nor do many of those who perform these jobs have four-year college degrees. But now we are calling them essential workers. So this could be the beginning Edmund, of a broader public debate about how to bring their pay and recognition into better alignment with the importance of the work they do and of the contribution they make.
Those sound like the words of a philosopher and a populist. Thank you. I think now is a good time for us to go to general Q&A from our audience. Questions submitted online either beforehand or in real time. And let's go then to our first question.
Thanks, Professor Sandel, for presenting on what was such an interesting book. I'm Jason Marsh from the Philosophy Department. I also direct the Public Affairs conversation. So my question to you can be posed in a more serious way. The less serious way is whether you've seen this recent tweet to Andrew Yang about your work. And someone says, have you read Sandel's recent book, The Tyranny of Merit? Andrew Yang's response is, no, but I like the sound of it. The question is whether you've seen that, but the more serious version of the question is whether you think the logic of your two claims is somehow connected, right? So Andrew Yang was a prior Institute guest, and he argues, as you know, for a universal basic income. One objection to universal basic income is merit, right? Once you strip away some of the power that merit has to give us access to goods and wealth, do you think of a natural alignment between your views and the views of Andrew Yang? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Jason. I had not seen that tweet, but I appreciate it. It's a difficult question for the following reason. I'm ambivalent about the universal basic income. I like the fact that it offers a way of decommodifying labor, at least to some extent, and providing everyone with a decent living and with purchasing power, quite apart from the way the market happens to value the talents they have to offer. And it also takes account of the fact that many of the most important contributions to the economy and especially to the society and the common good are not even mediated by the labor market. The unpaid labor, for example, involved in raising children and looking after households. So I liked that aspect of the universal basic income, especially if it could be generous enough truly to decommodify labor and give people meaningful choices in how they want to contribute, and if it could be done in a way that didn't drain funds from needed public services and healthcare and education, all of which are big ifs. My hesitation, and here I might disagree with Andrew Yang, is this. I think that one of the alternatives to a meritocratic society of winners and losers of the kind I allege we have evolved into is to shift to a political project focused on arming people for meritocratic competition to a political project that puts greater emphasis on renewing the dignity of work. And I think part of what it is to respect the dignity of work is to recognize that work is not only a way of making a living, it's also a way of contributing to the common good and winning respect and recognition for having done so. One of the most fundamental human needs, I think, is the need to be needed by our fellow citizens and to deploy our talents and efforts to answer those needs and to win recognition, to win esteem, to win respect for having done so. This, I think, is what's so galling about the sense among many working people that the work they do is not valued, that it's looked down upon, especially as the economy has become dominated by professional classes and finance, managing money and so on, great sources of esteem and reward. This is galling. And it's galling not just because material benefits accrue to the professional classes and to finance. And not only because working people face wage stagnation and job loss during the years of market-driven globalization. It's galling because many working people don't feel that their contribution matters. So my worry about a universal basic income is that it's offered by some, not by Andrew Yang, but by many in Silicon Valley are promoting this idea because they're saying, we're designing robots that are going to come and make work obsolete for a lot of working people. And so we're going to support a universal basic income, essentially to pay off the political opposition against the obsolescence of work by a large swath of the population. That worries me. It worries me that that's one political source of inspiration for UBI, but it also worries me if it seems to augur a way of life that does not involve reciprocal contribution and recognition, which I think is essential to holding a society together and cultivating a sense of common purposes and ends, a sense that we are all in this together. So, Jason, I'm sorry for a double-barreled kind of ambivalent response. The first part is drawn to the Andrew Yang idea. Second part registers a worry.
Thank you, Michael. That the answer reflects the complexity of these matters. The next question, please.
Good evening, Professor Sandel. After having closely followed your work for some time, I find your critique of meritocracy and the unencumbered self to be the most convincing critique of free market liberalism to date. However, as a conservative-leaning student who cares deeply about communal ties, I struggle to find a realistic conservative solution to the problems you lay out in the Tyranny of Merit. My question for you is this. How can I still remain true to my conservative values, my commitment to free enterprise, belief in limited government, the insistence on individual rights, and constitutional originalism, while also working to create a country where citizens are more indebted to one another as human beings and are reminded that they are not entirely responsible for their own success? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maxwell. And I can't help but notice that you're from Pacific Palisades, California, which is where I went to high school. I went to Palisades High School. So how is it possible to affirm and embrace the kind of critique of meritocracy that you find persuasive while still adhering to conservative principles? It's a fascinating question. I think it is possible, though I can't promise you, Maxwell, that in the course of working out an alternative to a kind of market-driven meritocratic society that invites us to think of ourselves as unencumbered selves, wholly responsible for our own success. I can't promise you that all of your conservative policies or even principles would be undisturbed, though I should say I would say the same for liberals. I think part of here's where I would begin, and you can be the judge whether this would be in line with conservative principles. I begin, as I've just said in response to the prior question, by saying we need to give more emphasis to the dignity of work. Now, the dignity of work and its implications can be interpreted in multiple ways and is by people coming from different ideological traditions and commitments. In the Tyranny of Merit, as you may have seen, I try to suggest that there is a progressive and there is a conservative way of developing a political agenda based on the dignity of work. And perhaps there could be some common ground between them. And as an example of the conservative way of building a political project about the dignity of work, I cite a conservative thinker named Cass, who has written a book about work and who's argued that Republicans, if they want to be true to conservative principles, should give up on a political agenda that consists mainly in tax cuts and laissez-faire labor market policies, and instead advance conservative principles of favoring labor market policies, including some labor market interventions, he argues, that promote family and neighborhood and community and the ability for Americans to have good jobs at good wages that enable them to support stable families and neighborhoods and contribute to their communities. Now, these, he argues, and I think rightly, these are conservative, good conservative values. His argument is that having such an approach to labor requires a certain departure from laissez-faire libertarian conservatism in favor of what one might call a kind of community-based conception of a conservative social policy. So, for example, he favors, and some conservative politicians have endorsed, the idea of wage subsidies for low-wage workers to reward work and to enable all workers to earn enough to be able to support families and stable communities. So I'm tempted, I know there are others who are waiting, but to see whether, if Maxwell could just reappear for one moment, whether this approach in the name of conservative principles, though it departs to some extent from laissez-faire libertarian labor market policies, is on the right track from your point of view, Maxwell. I don't know if you're still able to.
I think Max is not available right at the moment.
Okay, all right. So that would be one possible path.
And I take it that's in line what you were saying earlier about in your criticism, universal basic income. You prefer something like a wage subsidy to paying people whether they're working or not, because work is at the center of your vision of what it means to contribute to the common good, and it's the ground for what you call equality of condition that is absolutely essential to the forging of productive society.
Right, and I should quickly add, because I was emphasizing a kind of conservative scenario that that would respond to Maxwell's question as a conservative, but other policies in support of the dignity of labor might resonate more readily among progressives. For example, increasing the minimum wage, as is being debated now in Washington, or providing, having the federal government be the employer of last resort, which some progressives favor, or reorienting the tax system to tax work, to tax earned income at the same tax rate as income from capital and dividends and interest. Now, is that a liberal or a conservative policy? Well, it's not clear, because if the rationale for example, bringing the level of the capital gains tax into line with earned income from labor, if the rationale is to honor work, then that, it seems to me, could be possible common ground for progressives and conservatives who want to renew and affirm the dignity and the importance of work.
Thank you, Michael. I think we'll take a question now from our online live feed, and this from Alex Bearden of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Picks up on some of the things that you've been talking about already. It says, here's the question. According to the critique, that is to say your critique, market value, for example, of labor is not an accurate measure of the contribution to the common good. I'm sympathetic to your view, but I want to hear more about the relation between market value and the common good. Does your view imply, for example, that we ought to reform how we value labor to align with what we really value more in terms of the common good? In other words, pay chemistry teachers more and football players or hedge fund managers less? Or does your view imply that we ought to leave the markets alone and learn to value the common good more in other ways?
I think there are many ways of valuing the common good. Pay, and by extension, the tax system, is only one of them. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which the tax system, as well as the system of regulation, is an expression of the way we conceive the common good. Let me take one small example that I include in the book. Finance. In recent decades, as inequality has deepened and as meritocratic ways of thinking about success have tightened their hold on our public discourse, at the same time, we've seen the financialization of the economy. Finance has assumed a greater and greater share of GDP, and especially of corporate profits. Now, this raises a question: is it a good thing or a bad thing from the standpoint of the common good, but even from the standpoint of the productivity of the economy? And here I think we need to make a distinction. We need to distinguish between the traditional role of finance, which is to direct capital to socially useful and productive activities, financing new businesses, for example, new factories, homes, schools, hospitals, roads, airports, investing in productive activities in the real economy. That's one kind of finance. But much of finance today, and much of the increase in finance with financial deregulation, has not been of that kind. It's been speculative finance that consists not in investing in new productive capacity of the economy, but simply speculating on the future prices of already existing assets, many of them invented or synthetic derivatives and the like, that have precious little to do with investing in the productive capacity of the economy. So if we decide that that activity, that speculative side of finance, doesn't really contribute to the common good, and I think a case can be made for that, then we could consider a financial transactions tax on speculative finance or on high-frequency trading, and use the revenues from that to reduce or eliminate the workers' share of the payroll tax. Now, you might debate this policy from the traditional standpoint of distributive justice. Will the burden of taxation, shift from the rich to those to those less able to, who need it most? But I'm suggesting it's a way of registering and having a public debate about what contributions to the common good we should most value. The decisions we make about taxation and about regulation are not just technical choices. They're not only about efficiency. They also reflect competing conceptions of the common good, competing conceptions of what counts as valuable contributions to the economy and to society.
Thank you, Michael. Next question now from a student, Noah Mock.
Hi, Mr. Sandel. I'm Noah, and I'm a sophomore in the public affairs conversation here at St. Olaf. And my question to you is regarding the incentives of capitalism, as many economic issues appearing in the United States, from exorbitant healthcare costs to outsourcing jobs to increases in automation, seem to arise from the pursuit of a profit. I'm wondering what long-term policy solutions you envision addressing the issues of a profit incentive within a capitalist system, or if capitalism as a system is doomed to fail regardless of attempted policy solutions. Thank you.
It's a hard question, Noah, and an important one. I think the profit motive, if kept in its place, can be a way of organizing productive activity and the efforts of those who contribute to the economy. But everything depends on being able to contain and confine the profit motive to those activities in the economy and society where the profit motive won't drive out important social and civic goods. For example, in healthcare, take an example drawn from this moment of the pandemic. We have decided as a society, and so have countries around the world, that we will not allocate the COVID vaccines based on the free market. In the United States, now it's true the vaccine is in short supply, but it's being allocated by the federal government and by the states, not according to the highest bidder who bids most for the vaccine, but instead according to very deliberately created categories of priority, and we're all familiar with them. And the vaccine itself, the shot itself, is free to the user. We've decided as a society, and all societies have agreed to this arrangement, more or less, that the profit motive in terms of who gets the vaccine doesn't apply. And that's because other values are at stake. We don't think that protection from COVID should depend on the ability to pay. At least we don't with respect to the vaccine. You might argue, Noah, that with regard to the way we organize work, there are some whom we ask to incur great risk, like those delivery workers we were talking about, and whereas the rest of us can stay at home and not have to venture into stores and public places to get our groceries. But there too, you could argue whether that's a legitimate or illegitimate use of the profit motive. So the short answer, the direct answer to your question, Noah, is the profit motive can be useful if it can be confined to those domains of life involving the exchange of goods that do not involve driving out or threatening other values, such as everyone should have access to a COVID vaccine, regardless of their ability to pay. So that's a qualified answer. It's not to banish the profit motive, but it is to contain it and to constrain it and to keep it in its place, which is not, in a capitalist society like ours, it's not an easy thing to do.
Thank you, Michael. Next question.
In The Tyranny of Merit, you describe the widening political divide between voters with and without college degrees in Western democracies like the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. I'm curious if you have an idea as to why we see such a consistent movement of voters with college degrees towards left of center and even socialist parties, while we see voters without college degrees increasingly moving towards right-wing politics, particularly when this movement seems to contradict those groups' economic self-interests.
Right. Thank you, John, for that question. It is striking that center-left parties in the US and in Britain and in France and in other parts of Europe have undergone a transformation over the last couple of decades. These parties used to be parties that defended the interests and drew on the support of working people, defending the interests of working people against the powerful and the privileged. That was FDR's New Deal. That was the traditional Labour Party in Britain. That was the role of traditional social democratic parties throughout Europe. And in the last 2 or 3 decades, during the age of merit, this has changed. And the primary base by 2016, when Trump was elected, the Democratic Party in the US had become more attuned to the values and interests and outlook of college-educated, well-credentialed professional classes than to the blue-collar voters who traditionally constituted its base. And so, John, you rightly ask why. How did this happen? Well, I think one of the ways that it happened is that these center-left parties embraced the meritocratic political project that I've described. Let's go back a couple of decades. In the 1980s, the market faith arrived in the persons of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They argued government is the problem, free markets are the solution. When they passed from the political scene, John, and were replaced by center-left politicians, Bill Clinton in the US, Tony Blair in Britain, they did not fundamentally challenge the market faith, the idea that markets and market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. They accepted the premise. They moderated, they softened the harsh edges of a kind of laissez-faire free market capitalism, but they didn't challenge the market faith. And then in through the 90s, they embraced the deregulation of finance. And so gradually they became market-friendly parties that offered to deal with the inequality that came from a market-driven globalization, not by dealing with the inequality directly, but instead by saying, if you want to compete and win in the global economy, go to college. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. This was the message of the Democratic Party from Bill Clinton up through Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton in 2016 was her message. It was, I call it the rhetoric of rising. If you're struggling with wage stagnation and job loss due to outsourcing, don't worry. Go get a college degree, then you too will flourish. The offer was individual upward mobility through higher education. But what I'm suggesting, and for reasons that we've been discussing, is that this was an inadequate answer to inequality, to offer individual upward mobility. It helped a few. But remember, most Americans, most Britons, don't have a 4-year college degree. And so the result was to transform through this rhetoric of rising, through this offer of individual mobility as the solution to inequality. It left most working people behind. It privileged and valorized those who had been able to get a college degree, not only in terms of material success, but also in terms of honor and valorization and social prestige. And I think this has contributed, John, to the alienation of working people from these center-left parties that had defined their political project in terms of the rhetoric of rising, in terms of credentialism, in terms of telling workers, you want to improve yourself? Go to college. I think they missed the insult implicit in that advice. The implicit insult was this: if you didn't go to college, and if you're not flourishing in the new economy, your failure is your fault. I think this drove away working people, understandably, because it said, the problem is not our economic policies. The problem is not we who outsourced jobs and who deregulated finance. The problem is you didn't take the advice to go to college. That is a recipe for the alienation of working people who struggle in the new economy. And I think that's how these center-left parties alienated working people, even as they embraced credentialed professional elites.
Thank you, Michael. Next question.
Hello, Professor Sandel. Thank you for being here. My name is Kirtana, and I'm a sophomore at St. Olaf, majoring in economics and religion. I would like to ask you today, how would you redesign the medical school admission process, which is a meritocracy, while maintaining the necessary caliber of doctor required for societal health and safety?
And Kirtana, are you applying to medical school? Planning to? No, we can't.
No,
can't
I think she's not actually. So I'm
Okay,
going to
all right.
go out on the limb and answer that for you.
Okay, all right, fair enough. I think we should design admission policies for medical school in a way that will encourage those who are interested in the medical profession to take the kinds of courses and the academic preparation that will equip them to be good and effective doctors. And that includes being good at scientific and medical subjects. But it also includes, being a good doctor also includes the ability to connect with the communities whose health needs doctors ultimately serve. And those qualities include, in addition to being good at organic chemistry, include a devotion and a passion for caring and for healing, and for listening, and for the public dimensions of health as well as the personal dimensions of health. So, how best to measure for this range of qualities? Well, grades in science course, grades in organic chemistry may be relevant. Scoring well on the standardized tests they use for medical school may be relevant, but so I think should be a broad exposure to humanistic fields, as well as qualities of character that suggest the kinds of character traits that make for a good doctor.
Thank you, Michael. Here a question now from Sean Clements, class of 22 from St. Paul, Minnesota. I wonder what you think about a model in which resentment might be mitigated through a structured contribution by each citizen to the common good. I am imagining something like the public works system under FDR, where everyone is expected to join a public work program at some point in their lives. It seems that such a system could garner a sense of duty to the common good, put people in situations where they would work alongside fellow citizens from outside of their socioeconomic sphere, and most importantly, give people the sense that they are playing an active and necessary role in their society. When I suggest such a model to my peers, one concern is that such a system might lead to nationalist sentiments in the population. So your reaction to that, Michael?
I like Sean's proposal a lot. I would qualify it slightly, Sean. I think the best analogy is not to FDR's public works program, which was not really intended as a class mixing activity, but for those it was to build up the public sphere, but most of the people who got those jobs were people desperately in need of jobs. But I think where you're going, and where I would agree, would be with some notion of national service. And national service not only to perform important work that we need to do in areas of education and in health and in rural development, and in perhaps even the building of infrastructure as well as military service, but also for the sake of bringing people into contact with those from different walks of life, from different social and ethnic and economic class backgrounds. I think that's terribly important. And I very much like Sean's proposal, as it's motivated by the desire to build more class mixing institutions and practices in our society. Part of what creates the deep divide between winners and losers is the segmentation and segregation by class and by educational credentials. And so I would find very attractive a national service program that would bring people into contact with people from different walks of life and class backgrounds. I think that would be an important step toward healing the divisions and the silos, the separation that afflict us today.
Thank you, Michael.
I didn't answer the worry about nationalism.
Okay, go ahead.
I think my worry, I think there could be a risk of cultivating a kind of nationalism, but there's a fine line between nationalism, the kind that Sean worries about, and patriotism, or a sense of community. And at its best, if it were done well, a system of national service would not only create class mixing opportunities, but would also cultivate a sense of service, a service to the country, to the community as a whole. And this, I think, could be a tangible expression of a healthy patriotism, not the xenophobic kind of hyper-nationalism that we see and some of us worry about, but a kind of healthy sense of community that draws us out of our own highly individuated or confined spaces and places into a shared public space of democratic citizenship. Sorry, Edmund.
Thank you. Here we have a follow-up question from John Emmons, whom you responded to earlier. If I could follow up on my video question, it seems that at least in the U.S., the Democratic Party has started to thaw on its pro-market logic with pro-regulation and pro-intervention agendas like a $15 federal minimum wage. Yet in the 2020 election, the education gap was at its widest ever. How does the right-left split stay consistent even as the center-left's meritocracy commitments fade? Particularly when we look at candidates like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are most popular with young college graduates, yet present the most radical departure from the meritocratic consensus. What is so attractive about left-wing politics to the highly educated and similarly right-wing politics to the less educated?
Well, the appeal of Trump to especially white working class voters without a college education, I think has to do with the resentment and grievances that we've been discussing this evening and that I've tried to diagnose. Bernie Sanders' candidacy is interesting. In 2016, especially, when he was running in the primaries against Hillary Clinton, there were quite a number of working class voters who were torn between Trump and Bernie Sanders, which would seem very strange if you try to map it on an ideological left-right spectrum. But it would be consistent with the idea that both of them were challenging, though from different ideological perspectives, the standard mainstream market-driven meritocratic consensus of recent decades. Neither Trump nor Bernie Sanders spoke very much in terms of the rhetoric of rising, in terms of saying the goal is to create a society where everyone can rise as far as their efforts and talents would take us. This is the meritocratic rhetoric of rising that lends itself to the credentialism. They didn't even use as a primary language the language of opportunity, but instead for Trump, blunt talk of winners and losers, and America would be winning again. And for Bernie Sanders, he talked about inequalities of income and wealth and power and how to dismantle them and what policies could challenge them. So I do think there is a certain affinity would not be exactly the right word, a certain attraction for many working class voters, potentially to, if not a right-wing version of populism like that of Trump, to a left-wing populism of the kind that Bernie Sanders offered. I would say one other thing about it. the success of right-wing populism of the kind that we've seen in Trump, and that we may see in France with Marine Le Pen in the National Front, the success of right-wing populism is usually a symptom of the failure or the absence of a coherent and compelling left-wing populism or social democratic populism. And so whether with the Biden administration we will see a departure from, as John seems to think, the meritocratic rhetoric and political project, I think that remains to be seen. It is interesting to notice that Biden, who defeated Trump, was the first Democratic nominee in 36 years without an Ivy League degree. This may have enabled him to connect a little bit more readily with the working class voters whom Democrats had struggled to attract in recent decades. But more importantly, it might provide him a certain distance from the mainstream meritocratic political project that ran from Bill Clinton to Barack Obama to Hillary Clinton. It may provide him enough space to begin, maybe instinctively, if not deliberately, to offer, instead of a meritocratic political project, a political project based on the dignity of work, which he did speak about from time to time during the campaign. Whether he will translate that into a broader and fully developed political project and program remains to be seen. But it is worth noticing, I think, this subtle shift, at least, in emphasis and political rhetoric, as well as experience and background.
Thank you, Michael. We've come now to the end of our time. Thanks to the audience for joining us tonight in this stimulating exchange with world-renowned Harvard political philosopher Michael Sandel. And thanks so much to you, Michael, for being with us and for sharing with us your vision of merit's tyranny and what we as a society need to do to advance the common good.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
St. Olaf College's Institute for Freedom and Community continues its series of public events on America after Trump this spring term. Next event in this series is with three eminent China scholars, Sheena Greitens, Min-Shin Pei, and Jonathan Stromseth, on China after Trump. That event is scheduled for April 13th. This spring term, the Institute also continues its series of public events on the theme Diversity, Freedom, and Community. The next event in that series is with former New York Times columnist Barry Weiss on anti-Semitism and liberal freedom. That event is a week from tonight on March 11th, Thursday evening. Learn more about these and other events at institute.stolaf.edu. That's institute.stolaf.edu. We hope you can join us for those events. For now, good night, be safe, and be well.